heavily escorted Japanese convoy departs the fortress harbor of Rabaul, its wake churning the Bismarck Sea. Bound for the battlefields of New Guinea, the troop ships are crammed with men. Aboard one vessel, an officer from the Imperial Japanese Army's 51st Division addresses his soldiers. He declares their objective is to suppress New Guinea and then subjugate Australia, bringing the Great Asia War to a close. He tells them, the result of this single battle will decide the destiny of the entire war. In just a few days of destruction and chaos, more than half of the 6,000 soldiers and sailors in this convoy will be dead. It is early 1943. After months of bloody, vicious fighting on Guadalcanal and New Guinea, the balance of power in the Southwest Pacific has finally tipped in the Allies' favor. From his headquarters in Australia, General Douglas MacArthur is determined to maintain this new momentum. He begins planning a series of offensives to isolate the remaining Japanese forces on New Guinea and neutralize Japan's key forward base at Rabaul. The ultimate goal is to sever the Japanese Empire from the critical resources of the Dutch East Indies and the Philippines. But MacArthur, commanding the Southwest Pacific area, faces a unique strategic challenge. The primary offensive power of the U.S. Navy, its carrier task forces, is allocated to Admiral Nimitz's Central Pacific Drive. MacArthur must rely on his limited naval assets and a ground force comprised largely of Australian veterans. His most potent offensive weapon, the force he must leverage to win, is the fledgling U.S. Army's 5th Air Force. On New Guinea, the Japanese situation is deteriorating. Pushed back by the grinding efforts of the Australian and U.S. armies, the bulk of the Imperial Japanese Army is bottled up in a pocket around the coastal town of Lae. Supplies are running desperately short. The harsh jungle conditions and the ever-present threat of tropical diseases are proving as deadly as Allied bullets. Japanese Army headquarters knows it must break the stalemate. They plan to resupply their beleaguered troops and land reinforcements to secure a larger perimeter. This reinforcement can only be accomplished by sea. A first attempt is made on January 6, 1943. A convoy of 5 troop ships and 5 escorts carrying 4,000 troops from the 51st Infantry Division sails from Rabaul. Constant cloud coverage and poor weather hamper the Allied air response to this January convoy. Piecemeal air attacks harass the Japanese formation, but only one transport is sunk. Critically, most of the fresh troops make it safely ashore. Encouraged by this success, Japanese planners immediately begin organizing a second, larger resupply effort. But the heavy losses suffered by the Imperial Japanese Navy during the Tokyo Express supply runs to Guadalcanal have left their staff with a healthy respect for Allied air power. They soberly estimate that any new convoy could lose half of its ships. The new effort is designated Operation 81. It will transport the rest of the 51st Division, naval infantry units, 3 months' worth of supplies, and the headquarters of the new Japanese 18th Army. All are destined to reinforce the besieged perimeter at Lae. The importance of Operation 81 is so great that it achieves the near impossible. The Imperial Japanese Army and Navy temporarily bury the hatchet, putting aside their ferocious and immensely counterproductive inter-service rivalry. This rivalry is legendary, often seeing the two branches hoard resources and obstruct each other's plans. But for this mission, they agree to jointly provide over 100 fighters to fly protective cover for the convoy. The Japanese are not the only ones preparing for battle. Lieutenant General George Kenny, commander of the U.S. Army's 5th Air Force, is also seeking a more effective method of destroying enemy shipping. Kenny knows that stopping this reinforcement is paramount, but his existing tools are failing. Pre-war doctrine envisaged high-altitude bombers like the B-17 as long-range anti-ship weapons. This theory was put to the test at the Battle of Midway, with disastrous results. The fundamental flaw was simple. Maneuvering ships, even lumbering transports, are nearly impossible to hit with bombs dropped from medium or high altitude. The bombs took too long to fall, giving captains ample time to turn away from the splashes. Kenny directs his staff to explore more radical options, resulting in the adoption of 2 new low-level attack profiles. The first is skip bombing. This tactic is particularly well suited to medium bombers, like the B-25 Mitchells and A-20 Havocs. It requires the aircraft to fly at a very low level, around 200 feet, and release its bombs short of the target. The bombs, often with delayed fuses, then skip across the surface of the water and slam into the side of the ship's hull. A similar method is masthead bombing. In this attack, the aircraft flies at extremely low level, aiming to clear the ship's mast by mere feet. The pilot drops a delayed fuse bomb directly onto the ship at the last possible second. Through January and February of 1943, U.S. and Australian crews relentlessly practiced these new tactics. They use a wrecked steamship off Port Moresby as their target, honing their dangerous, low-level skills. But attacking from such a low altitude has one major deadly drawback. The attacking aircraft are easy targets for the ship's defending anti-aircraft fire. The solution is the brainchild of a mechanically minded Army officer, aptly named Major Paul "Pappy" Gunn. Gunn's war is intensely personal. His family is imprisoned in an internment camp in the occupied Philippines. He is driven to find new ways to strike back. Gunn devises a new field modification for the Army Air Force's A-20 Havocs and B-25 Mitchells. He rips out the bombardier's position in the nose and replaces it with a devastating bank of Browning .50 caliber machine guns. These are scavenged from armories and salvaged from written-off aircraft. He also adds more .50 caliber guns, mounted in blisters on the fuselage. General Kenny immediately realizes the potential. These new strafers can wreak havoc on ships, but more importantly, they can suppress the deadly anti-aircraft batteries, paving the way for the skip-bombing aircraft. He brings Gunn in as a technical advisor and orders him to produce more of the variant. Gunn's final prototype, the B-25C Strafer, is armed with 8 forward-firing Browning M2 machine guns. In late January 1943, this new gunship is dispatched to Port Moresby. It is used to familiarize the pilots and crews of the 3rd Bomb Group with the modification. The airmen quickly take to the new approach, eagerly practicing strafing runs. Soon 12 B-25s of the group's 90th Bombing Squadron are modified into these formidable gunships. By late February, Allied intelligence knows something is brewing. American and Australian codebreakers, working under General MacArthur's Southwest Pacific Area Command, intercept and decipher Japanese signals. The messages suggest a major convoy will sail from Rabaul to Lae on either February 28th or March 1st. This intelligence is soon corroborated by aerial reconnaissance. The news is grim. Allied ground forces in New Guinea, while still possessing the upper hand, are spread thin. They are suffering badly from the arduous jungle conditions. Australian forces alone have 14,000 troops hospitalized with malaria and other tropical diseases, on top of the 6,000 casualties already suffered in the campaign. It is unlikely that they and their American comrades can stop a renewed reinforced Japanese offensive. The weather, initially, favors the Japanese convoy. A tropical cyclone is charging through the region, churning the Bismarck Sea. The Japanese command hopes this storm will conceal their movement from Rabaul. Strong winds and lashing rain sweep the decks of the 8 transport ships and their 8 escorts from the Imperial Japanese Navy's Destroyer Squadron 3. They set sail exactly as predicted. At midnight on February 28th, leading the convoy is the flagship of Destroyer Squadron 3, the Fubuki-class destroyer Shirayuki. Aboard is Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura. Kimura is an experienced veteran, having seen action at Midway and in the early battles around the Dutch East Indies. The storm successfully shrouds the force's departure in thick clouds and mist through most of the next day. At 1600 hours on March 1st, however, the convoy's luck runs out. A U.S. Army Air Force B-24 Liberator on patrol spots the flotilla through a break in the clouds. While usually remembered as a heavy bomber, the B-24's superb endurance makes it an outstanding long-range reconnaissance aircraft. The crew keeps their distance, avoiding the circling Japanese Zero fighters, and radios their contact report back to 5th Air Force headquarters. Signalmen aboard the Japanese destroyers intercept the American report. There is little they can do about the retreating patrol aircraft. All the sailors and soldiers in the convoy can do now is brace for the inevitable onslaught. At first light on March 2nd, patrolling B-24s and B-17s struggle to maintain intermittent contact. The convoy hugs the coast of New Britain, dodging in and out of gaps in the cloud cover and thunderstorms. The Japanese respond with heavy air cover from bases on New Britain and from Lae. At any one time, around 30 Imperial Japanese Navy Zeros and Army Ki-43 Oscars maintain a standing combat air patrol over the ships. The persistent cloud cover, however, prevents them from engaging the American scouts. General Kenny's planners move to whittle down this enemy air cover. 6 Royal Australian Air Force Boston bombers sweep in low over the jungle canopy toward the Japanese airfield at Lae. They catch the airfield unprepared, destroying parked fighters with bombs and .50 caliber gunfire. They leave many A6M Zeros burning in their revetments. Meanwhile, a strike force of 26 B-17 Flying Fortresses is led by a pair of liberators toward the convoy's last known position. A flight of Japanese Ki-43 Oscars moves to intercept them. The escorting American P-38 Lightnings dive on the Japanese fighters, downing 3 in quick succession. At 9:50 a.m., the leading B-17 spot the convoy and commence their high-altitude bombing run. 7 Fortresses from the 63rd Bomb Squadron spearhead the attack. They release their loads of 1,000-pound bombs onto the desperately evading ships, thousands of feet below. A6M Zeros attack the bomber formation from above and below, but are forced off by the high-powered P-38 escorts. The rest of the Fortresses, from the 64th and 65th Squadrons, follow them in. In the chaos of the battle, the observing B-24s try their luck as well. They toss another 12 bombs into the Japanese formation, which is steaming through a sea boiling with near misses and exploding ordnance. Almost all of the American bomber crews claim hits, but the actual result is more modest. The merchant ship Kyokusei Maru is struck mortally and begins to sink. 2 other transports are damaged, though only lightly. The destroyers Yukikaze and Asagumo race to the scene and pull 950 surviving soldiers and sailors from the water around the doomed merchantmen. Another B-17 raid later that evening causes no further damage. It is the last the Allies see of the convoy on March 2nd, before it is shrouded in the relative safety of night. With the fall of darkness, Admiral Kimura orders Asagumo and Yukikaze, both packed to the gunwales with survivors, to sail on ahead. They are to make best speed for Lae, to offload their passengers. As it stands, Kimura's losses are no worse than those of the successful January convoy. Despite losing fighters to the P-38s and the raid on Lae airfield, the Imperial Army and Navy can still provide air cover. Operation 81 can still succeed if they can just survive the next day. While the Japanese ships reorganize, a Royal Australian Air Force Catalina flying boat spots the wakes of the ships on the inky black ocean. Throughout the night, the slow, vulnerable flying boat harasses the convoy. It drops flares to track them and bombs at random, ensuring the Japanese crews get no rest. As the destroyers and troop ships pass through the Vitiaz Strait in the early morning hours, the weather worsens. It is here that Admiral Kimura makes a fateful decision. As Yukikaze and Asagumo return from Lae, the admiral decides to hold his position. For hours, the convoy steams in circles, only setting a clear course for Lae at dawn. Exactly why Kimura did this remains unclear. He potentially sought to use a front of poor weather, sweeping across the Bismarck Sea. Under this cover, his ships might slip into Lae unscathed. It is the same storm front Shang that is battering many of the Allied airfields early that morning. Most Allied bases suspend operations, but 7 Bristol Beaufort torpedo bombers of 100 Squadron Royal Australian Air Force take off from Milne Bay. They brave the extreme turbulence, thick cloud cover, and driving rain, Mechanical and navigational problems force 5 of the aircraft to return to base. At 6:25 a.m., the remaining 2 Beauforts make their attack, dropping to just feet above the waves. They run in with torpedoes. One torpedo glides harmlessly past a destroyer. The other refuses to drop from the aircraft, and the frustrated aviators are forced to return empty-handed. While the Australian Beauforts make their attack, the weather finally begins to clear over the Allied air bases. The Japanese force is now dangerously close to its destination. General Kenny seizes the closing window of opportunity. At 8:03 a.m. on March 3rd, he issues the order for a coordinated, all-out attack. The message is simple. Enemy convoy approaching New Guinea. Probable destination Lae. 5th Bomber Command will attack, with maximum striking force. Within minutes, maintainers, armorers, and ground crews are rushing around their aircraft. They make final checks, load bombs, and feed long belts of ammunition into machine guns. At the Allied air bases around Port Moresby, 90 aircraft are roaring to life and thundering skyward. This will not be a simple, chaotic assault. Kenny's plan is a sophisticated, multi-altitude coordinated strike designed to systematically dismantle the convoy's defenses. It is a high anvil and low hammer strategy. The attack will begin with high-altitude bombers, not to sink ships, but to act as a feint. Their goal is to draw the Japanese fighter cover up to high altitude, and just as importantly, to force the convoy's ships to begin evasive maneuvers, breaking their tight, mutually supporting formation. Once the Zeros are occupied high above and the convoy is scattered, the real killing blow will be delivered at wave-top height. Waves of new, low-level strafers and bombers will sweep in to attack the now exposed and vulnerable ships. Ahead of the main force, another strike of Royal Australian Air Force Boston's hits the Lae Air Base. It is the first of 30 separate attacks that will keep the Japanese airfields at Lae shut down throughout the day, preventing any fighters there from assisting the convoy. By 9:30 a.m., the weather over the Bismarck Sea is substantially better than it was in the early morning. The sky is clear, with only scattered clouds. All 16 Allied squadrons have successfully rendezvoused and now press forward toward their targets. Leading the Armada are 13 B-17 flying fortresses of the U.S. 43rd Bombardment Group. They are the first to sight the Japanese vessels. The merchant ships are sailing in 2 columns, 800 meters apart, led by 2 destroyers. Another 3 escorts are screening each flank of the formation. Bombardiers peer through their Norden bomb sights as the fortresses hold steady at 7,000 feet. The first black bursts of flak flash around them, but the clear weather is a double-edged sword for the Japanese. Over 30 A6M Zeros peel away from their combat air patrol, swirling down to meet the American heavy bombers. Just as the Zeros draw close, the escorting P-38 Lightnings slash into their formation, their supercharged engines screaming. Faster than the Zeros, the Lightnings use their horsepower and energy advantage, diving on their enemies from above when possible. The Japanese Navy fighters, however, are formidable opponents, and a swirling dogfight erupts. 1,000-pound bombs tumble from the B-17 bays, but as predicted, they score no hits. The high-altitude bombing has served its purpose. The convoy is now maneuvering wildly, its formation broken. The Zeros are fully engaged, distracted, and high above the sea. The anvil is in place. Now came the hammer. Beneath them, at wave-top height, 30 Squadron Royal Australian Air Force joins the fray. 13 Bristol Beaufighters sweep toward the ships, known as the 10-gun Terror. The Beaufighter is a beast of an aircraft. It is formidably armed, with 4 20mm cannons under the nose and 6 303 machine guns in the wings. The Beaufighter crews are forced to weave through the accurate Japanese anti-aircraft fire. They also have to dodge the bursts of water thrown skyward by the wildly inaccurate American bombs falling from above. Spotting the low-flying aircraft, the captains of the packed troop ships mistakenly anticipate another torpedo attack. They turn their ships, bow on toward the attackers, hoping to present the smallest possible target. This decision proves fatal. The Japanese ships have unwittingly presented the perfect strafing target. Each Australian pilot chooses a merchant ship and lets loose. The cannons and machine guns erupt. The pilots walk the hailstorm of explosive shells and incendiary bullets across the sea of troops crowding the decks and into the ship's superstructure, wreaking unspeakable carnage. Roaring over the vessels, through ineffective rifle fire from the surviving soldiers, the Australian fighters swing out to attack again. Through the swirling melee of marauding bow fighters and careening warships, the U.S. 90th Bomb Squadron begins its attack, flying Pappy Guns' heavily armed B-25C strafers. The American bombers work in pairs, angling toward the merchant ships. One bomber opens up with its 8 Browning 50 caliber machine guns. The combined rate of fire of over 6,000 rounds per minute thrashes the decks, scything down anti-aircraft crews. Meanwhile, the other B-25 in the pair lines up on the now defenseless merchant ship and executes a perfect skip bombing run. A notable target is the Kembu Maru. Its cargo of aviation fuel ignites, consuming the ship in a catastrophic fireball. One American airman watches in awe as the Beaufighters and B-25s ravage the nearby troop ships. "I was watching hundreds of those Japanese just blown off the deck by those machine guns," he recalled. "They just splintered around the air like sticks in a whirlwind, and they'd fall into the water." Major Ed Larner, the commander of the 90th Bomb Squadron, hauls his B-25 around. He lines up on the destroyer Shirayuki, Admiral Kimura's flagship, at the head of the formation. He and his wingman let fly, with a withering hail of lead. The 50 caliber rounds rip through the thinly armored gun houses, disabling her 5-inch batteries, cutting down her anti-aircraft crews, and devastating the bridge, hurtling just over the mast. At 100 feet, Larner releases a pair of 500-pound bombs. One slices through her deck and explodes deep in the hull. The explosion detonates her aft magazine, blasting the destroyer's stern clean off. The Shikinami races to the aid of the wounded flagship. She pulls alongside to take off her surviving crew. Admiral Kimura, hit in the shoulder by a machine gun bullet, staggers aboard and resumes command, attempting to save what is left of his convoy, as his old flagship slips beneath the waves. The destroyers, Arashio and Tokitsukaze, weave around the remaining merchant ships, putting up as much defensive fire as possible. They thunder away with their 5-inch main guns, but they cannot provide the necessary weight of fire. Their anti-aircraft battery is anemic, armed with just 2 25mm medium-caliber guns and a pair of 13mm machine guns each. The Arashio is strafed heavily, either by Beaufighters or B-25s. Her bridge crew and helmsman are killed or injured. She carves blindly through the water, out of control, and plows directly into the merchantman Nojima. The collision causes fatal damage to both ships, before the crippled destroyer is finished off by 3 bombs from attacking Mitchells. The Tokitsukaze is also strafed and skip-bombed by more B-25s. A 500-pound bomb destroys her engine room, leaving her dead in the water, on fire and flooding rapidly. Her crew is forced to abandon ship. The Yukikaze, one of the destroyers that had earlier raced to lie, rushes to her side. Her crew begins pulling their comrades from the sea. Among the survivors rescued from the sinking destroyer is the 18th Army commander, General Adachi. The last wave of the main strike now thunders in. 12 of 20 Havocs of the 89th Bomb Squadron begin their own skip bombing attacks. The fast, low-level attackers come in at 100 feet, their own nose-mounted machine guns blazing. Their semi-armor-piercing bombs skip like stones and punch through the hull plating of their targets, erupting deep inside the ships. No one wants to leave, while they still have ammunition. The swarm of Beaufighters, B-25s, and A-20s continues to circle the chaos, strafing and bombing the burning hulks and resisting destroyers until their guns run dry. High above, the dogfight between the P-38s and Zeros still rages. A few Japanese stragglers managed to dive through the P-38 screen, harassing the Mitchells and damaging one Beaufighter. Japanese reinforcements arrive, desperate to press the attack on the now homeward-bound B-17s. 18 A6M30s join the aerial dogfight. They avoid most of the lightnings, but the gunners of the flying fortresses manage to keep the Zeros at bay with a wall of defensive fire. Determined to avenge their devastating losses, one of the Japanese pilots performs a ramming attack on a B-17, slicing the heavy bomber in half. 7 of the American crewmen bail out, but 3 of the newly arrived Zeros dive on them, gunning down the airmen as they hang helplessly in their parachutes. The entire coordinated attack, from the first Beaufighter run to the last A-20 pass, is over in just 15 frantic minutes. Who sank what? In the maelstrom of bombs, cannon shells, and bullets is impossible to tell. But the extent of the damage is beyond doubt. All 8 of the Japanese troop ships are either sinking or are consumed by fires raging out of control. 3 destroyers, Shirayuki, Arashio, and Tokitsukaze, are crippled and sinking. The combined skip bombing and strafing tactic proved lethally effective. Mitchell crews, alone, claim 21 hits, with the A-20s claiming a further 11. In return, Allied losses for the day's operations are light. They stand at 3 P-38 Lightnings and 1 B-17 shot down, with 1 Beaufighter and 1 Mitchell damaged. Broken up by the relentless air attacks, the Convoy is now a debris field, spread over 9 square miles of ocean. Thousands of Japanese sailors and soldiers thrash in the oil-slicked water. Thousands more huddle in lifeboats, cling to floating debris, or sit packed on the listing, burning hulks of their ships. The surviving destroyers traverse the scene of destruction, rescuing as many survivors as they can hold. At 2 p.m., with their decks crammed with rescued men, the remaining Japanese destroyers depart at high speed for Rabaul. They are watched by a lingering B-24 Liberator, which circles high above the carnage. Just an hour later, at 3 p.m., the 5th Air Force launches a second strike to mop up the survivors. A massive weather front has now settled over the formidable Owen Stanley mountain range. This prevents the Australian Beaufighters and several of the A-20 squadrons from participating. The B-17s and the Mitchells of the 3rd Bomb Group constitute the bulk of this final strike force. From medium altitude, the B-17s bombard the still-floating merchant hulks. This time, their accuracy is more impressive. They obliterate 2 of the surviving transports, sending them to the bottom. As the B-17s clear the target, 22 Squadron Royal Australian Air Force slips in at low level. 5 A-20 Bostons fly and trail, one after another, as they descend to 1,100 feet. Spotting the Australians, 7 Zeros race over, cutting in behind the Bostons. But in their line astern formation, the Boston's rear gunners are able to provide concentrated fire. They drive off the unusually cautious Zeros long enough for more P-38s to join the fray. The Lightnings down one of the Japanese fighters, though they lose another P-38 in the dogfight. Squadron leader Charles Curnow watches, as just seconds ahead of them, American B-25Cs tear over the sea, their noses ablaze with 50 caliber gunfire. They rake the crippled Arashio from bow to stern, killing what is left of her anti-aircraft gun crews. Met with now negligible resistance, the Australian Bostons have an easy target. They finish off the destroyer with a pair of 250-pound bombs, with another 10 landing close alongside. Night soon falls over the Bismarck Sea. The air attacks draw to a close for the day, but the ordeal, for the weary and shell-shocked survivors, still scattered across the dark water, is far from over. Under the light of the moon, 8 U.S. Navy PT boats cut through the black waters of the Huon Gulf. Sailing from their advanced base at Milne Bay, the patrol craft are prowling for any Japanese ships still afloat. A crewman manning the boat's 50 caliber machine guns spots the dark shadows of ships, illuminated by distant fires on the horizon. Lieutenant Commander Barry Atkins, stands on the open-top bridge of the lead vessel and brings his force in for the attack. Atkins will later go on to sink the battleship Fuso at the Battle of Surigao Strait. On this night, his target is the crippled troopship Oigawa Maru. The PT boats unleash their torpedoes, and the final victim of the day's battle is sent to the bottom of the sea, aboard lifeboats and clumped together in the water. Thousands of surviving Japanese soldiers and sailors struggle to make their destination. Lieutenant Commander Atkins' PT boats attempt to pick up some of the survivors they come across. But the Japanese soldiers, adhering to a strict code of no surrender, often swim away from their potential salvation, refusing to be rescued. Back at Allied headquarters, General MacArthur and General Kenny assess the situation. They agree that the surviving Japanese soldiers, if they make landfall, still pose a significant threat to their beleaguered ground troops. They issue a controversial and brutal order. The helpless survivors in the water are to be strafed. Through March 4th, the slaughter commences. U.S. 5th Air Force aircraft, including B-25s, A-20s, and Australian Beaufighters, sweep the Huon Gulf and the Bismarck Sea. They systematically gun down hundreds of men in the water. In one particularly grim attack, a flight of B-25s massacres a large group of survivors, expending 18,000 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition. That night, the PT boats return, prowling the same patch of sea. They find lifeboats and rafts, packed with desperate men. They rake the small craft with tracer fire, continuing the brutal business. The attacks carry on into March 5th as 30 squadrons Beaufighters return to attack barges and small boats, carrying the last remnants toward shore. One Australian navigator noted in his log, "The water in the bottom of the barges was red with blood. You could see the sea was stained all around. An estimated 350 Japanese soldiers and sailors are killed on the 5th alone." As time wears on, the dwindling number of survivors are carried away from the scene of the battle by the currents and prevailing winds, their ordeal finally ending. For the Imperial Japanese Army, Operation 81 is a total unmitigated failure. All 8 of their troopships and 4 of their destroyers have been sunk. In the destruction of the convoy and the horrific killing that followed, an estimated 3,000 Japanese sailors and soldiers have been killed, while 2,700 men were saved, primarily by the surviving destroyers. The 51st Division has been functionally destroyed as a fighting force. The battle decisively proved that any major attempt to resupply Japanese forces on New Guinea by sea was no longer tenable. Allied air superiority, now firmly established, was absolute. This victory was secured at a comparatively light cost. Only 6 Allied aircraft were shot down during the multi-day operation, and just 13 Allied airmen were killed in action. American and Australian forces would go on to collapse the Japanese redoubt at Lae in September 1943. The combination of Allied air and naval superiority allowed MacArthur's Southwest Pacific Command to implement its island-hopping strategy. It could now bypass large, isolated pockets of Japanese forces and heavily fortified bases like Rabaul. This victory kept the offensive moving at pace toward the Philippines and the Dutch East Indies. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea was a watershed moment. After a year of brutal, barbaric fighting on and around New Guinea, Guadalcanal, and throughout the Solomon Islands, a few short but vicious days had changed the course of the war in the theater. A winning combination of tactical innovation and technical ingenuity, born from strategic necessity, had secured Allied dominance in the Southwest Pacific. If it was in any doubt before, there could be none now. The Allies were on the road to victory. It just remained to be found. How many more lives, on both sides, would be lost before that road reached its end?